2. Order. Well, welcome everybody to the latest meeting of the Environmental Audit Committee, our final hearing on our inquiry on addressing the risks from perfluoroalkyl and polyfluoroalkyl substances, otherwise known as PFAS chemicals. In today's first panel, we are joined by representatives of both the Environment Agency and the Health and Safety Executive. It starts in with yourself, Mr. Daniels. If I may, can I just invite you to introduce yourself and your role within the organisation, and particularly its relevance to the subject of PFAS.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So it's Dr. Richard Daniels. I'm Director of the Chemicals Regulation Division, which is part of the Health and Safety Executive. I've been involved with UK REACH for just over the last 5 years. I took up the position when the UK left the EU, so standing up the agency, which HSE in law is the agency for UK REACH. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Parks.
Good afternoon. I'm Liz Parks from the Environment Agency. I'm a Deputy Director there, and I lead our work on chemicals, also on climate change and on market regulation. I took over the chemicals work just under 2 years ago, but have been a long-standing regulator with the Environment Agency since we were formed in '96. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Womersley.
Good afternoon, everyone. Matt Womersley. I manage the Environment Agency's Chemical Regulatory Development Team. We have responsibility for the regulation of persistent organic pollutants and mercury, and we coordinate the Environment Agency's work on PFAS.
Okay, great. Well, obviously some of our questions will be to Mr. Daniels. I think the questions for the Environment Agency will probably direct towards yourself, Ms. Parks. If you think Mr. Womersley would be better to answer them, then we'll leave you to decide that. I'll start with you, if I may. How do you ensure that your evidence gathering and scientific analysis are shared and aligned with other regulators and advisory bodies in this space?
Thank you. So it's really important that we build on the very best evidence globally across Europe and across the UK. There are many fora through which we share our evidence and build on others. So, for instance, there's the Norman network that accesses research from 70 organisations, analytical work. We work in close partnership with sectors such as the water sector through the Chemical Investigation Programme. And we try and make all of our information as publicly available as we can, but you'll appreciate this is a very complex area, and we think there is more we can collectively do to help share understanding across the UK and enable every public body and every company to take the action it needs to take.
And yourself, Mr. Daniels, how do you think the evidence gathering and scientific analysis that your organisation has is shared with other organisations, other regulatory bodies, and is there room for improvement in that sort of cross-departmental work?
Thank you. So we do work closely with other regulatory bodies, certainly with the Environment Agency, who's part of the REACH network. We work closely with people like the Office of Product Safety Standards, food standards agencies. We attend a number of government committees, so the Committee on Toxicology, etc. So we are fully joined up across government. The information that we have, and when we're taking forward work in REACH, we do put out into the public domain. So we currently have a public consultation that's due to end in 2 weeks' time on firefighting foam, which we may go into, where all of our analysis, all of our information is put into the public domain, including all of the conclusions of previous work on REACH. So in that regard, what we have, we try to share, and in terms of the information and conclusions that we have, we do put into the public domain. That is a requirement of REACH, and we are very open in doing that.
Okay, great. And I mean, from your perspective, do you think that your organisation has the capacity to deliver on the responsibilities that have been set out in the new PFAS plan? Are there any things within that that would cause you concern in terms of your current capacity?
In terms of the PFAS plan, no, we've been heavily involved with that with colleagues from DEFRA, who clearly have the policy lead and the strategic responsibility. So every year we do develop a work programme that is agreed across it, and that is always based on the resources that we have. So the area in the PFAS plan for HSE, the firefighting foam one, is the priority. That was the priority agreed in 2023. We are taking forward, we're aiming to complete a recommendation to DEFRA by the end of this work year. The other 3 actions specifically for HSE is now what next, moving on to the other areas where we will be engaging with DEFRA and others to identify the best way to take that forward and which things to target next. So at this moment, no concerns over our ability to deliver that.
Yeah, and Ms. Parks, there have been observations that over a considerable number of years, the overall resources in the Environment Agency have reduced. Obviously, this government, previous one, very focused on water regulation and that aspect. To what extent do you feel that the Environment Agency is properly equipped to enact the things that might be envisaged as a result of the PFAS plan? And are there any sort of either knowledge or resource gaps within the organisation that exist if we are going to take more stringent regulatory action on PFAS?
Perhaps if I can first just explain how we're funded at the moment to do this work and then come to the new PFAS plan. So DEFRA have been funding us for a number of years and we have about £10 million specifically targeted at our work on chemicals in the round. PFAS is a part of that, and probably about a quarter of that effort goes on to PFAS, but we do need to focus on other chemicals as well. That enables me to have access to an amazing team of about 100 professionals across our organisation who have expertise, on science, on monitoring, on different media, on different sectors and regulatory regimes. And that work, that funding enables us to deliver quite a wide range of programme focused on chemicals, and over the years we've been advancing our knowledge, our understanding, the monitoring, and we're at that point now where we're evolving our approach to focus more on what can we do as a consequence, so the regulation. Yeah. So that funding covers the programme of work we do currently. Obviously the PFAS plan that's just been published sets out some additional actions. It's probably fair to say about half of the actions in the plan will fall to the agency. And probably half of those, again, we're already on with, but there is undoubtedly new action in there, as you might expect. So what we're going to need to do is to unpack with government, what does that look like? It's not just about funding, it's about capacity and priorities, and we need to take a balanced view in the Environment Agency about all the work we need to do to protect the environment and public health and make sure that we can spend the money we've got from government wisely to deliver that. I think longer term, it's challenging because this is grant and aid funding, and I think you'll all appreciate that regulatory work needs to be put on a sustainable charging footing so that the polluter's paying and that we can spend public money as sensibly as we can. So that would be my plan, overall direction of travel.
Thank you very much. Julia Buckley.
Thank you, Chair. As a question for Richard Daniels. So the government's made a commitment to take regulatory decisions that are made by other trusted jurisdictions as the starting point for action under UK REACH. And I wonder, how will the Health and Safety Executive provide expert support to the government in that endeavour?
Thank you. So the first thing is, I think it's been recognised in the commitment, is currently we can't do that in a way because the way that the law is framed. And therefore we will support with DEFRA those changes to actually help us do that in practice. So, for example, just directly for agency to say we will do what, for example, the EU as our nearest and closest partner in terms of regulation does. But that doesn't mean that we're not aware of what the EU is doing. They do put a lot of information in the public domain through the European Chemicals Agency that we do look at. We do look at it closely. Because having been part of that network 6 or 4 years ago, and I have people working for myself that were part of that network, they are respected, they are trusted, they do know that good science in terms of that technical basis. So that helps us be the starting point to see what is being done and perhaps some of the challenges that the EU has faced. So once we do get to the point of saying we perhaps don't need to do everything that the current REACH legislation requires of us. We can look at how that accelerates the process, so that very much that front end technical analysis we might be able to speed up using what the EU, for example, as a trusted jurisdiction has done, and then look at it. What does that mean actually in practice for the UK? Because there may be some bits that are different for us in the UK that's not part of the EU norm.
So you're suggesting a sort of pick and mix, take the best bits and take them forward?
Well, I think the thing is, why would we as a regulator ignore what other people have done where it is based on good science and evidence? That doesn't make sense. The reason why we are in the position is when we left the EU, if you like, the legislation was frozen, and some changes we were required, and we set up the agency under UK REACH. Other bits under my responsibilities are the chemicals regulatory systems. So we've been on that path of the independent approach. We haven't been able to engage at a technical level with the EU, but very much I think I would hope going forward we can take the best of both worlds, as it were, be as close as we can where it makes sense, but obviously advise government if perhaps we need to tweak or change where there may be issues.
Just on that EU point, I'll hand over to my colleague, Martin Rhodes.
Thank you, Chair. Just in terms of greater clarity, that at the moment what you're saying is that the European Chemicals Agency puts information into the public domain, which is useful, and you look at that. How do you see yourselves actually using that information going forward? Are you saying that it potentially to develop from just looking at it to actually using it?
Well, in terms of our current way of working, because in a number of areas the EU is ahead, they have put out a technical assessment, a risk assessment in terms of the analysis. So my colleagues and experts in HSE look at that as a basis in terms of trying to shape how should we approach it, what has the EU identified in terms of some of the hazards, etc. Now, some of that and the requirements of REACH require us actually to do our own analysis. So some of that may be from scratch, some of it may be using some of the things in the public domain, because looking at it we say, yes, that's relevant, that's appropriate, we don't need to, if you like, second guess that. We use that as the basis. So that's the way it's built in. But the current requirements of the legislation is we have to form our own view, our own opinion, the various tests for REACH. If you're heading for a restriction, what are the alternatives? Are they viable, for example? What is the socio-economic impact of applying these things in practice, for example, in the UK environment? And that can be very different from at an EU level. There are maybe some areas that's been looked at the EU that aren't as relevant for the UK because the substances or the particular uses aren't that big in the UK, but they are for the EU. So it's an informed use of that information because it is publicly available. What we don't have access to at the moment is, as the EU are working through these things, we don't have access to the early information, the evidence, the discussions at expert level that we used to have. So we're always, if you like, behind and using public information, not as part of the mechanism as it is developing and emerging. I don't know if that helps.
Yeah, no, it does. In terms of the situation, as I understand what you're saying, is that you've got that information once it's in the public domain, but you're not part of that earlier process of actually seeking the evidence, and
yes.
We don't have that ability. In terms of the developments, in terms of the work here in the UK and how it might diverge and how you might advise to do things differently, I think you, on your last answer, you're beginning to talk about that possibility in terms of it's really on what basis would you advise the government that the UK should diverge from the European approach?
I think it's interesting when you talk about divergence, because if you allow me, Mr. Chair, that I think there can be divergence in terms of timing, which is we may well end up at the same place, but the length of time it will take to get there may be different between ourselves and the EU. So at the moment for UK REACH, largely the EU is ahead of the UK, But other areas that I'm responsible for example, in pesticides, we actually are ahead of the EU in some areas. So there's a thing of we'll end up at the same place. It's a matter of time. The second thing is divergence on where we may end up advising or recommending a different decision. And that either could be we recognise and agree that there is a problem to be solved, but REACH may not be the solution for that. There may be other legislation that we have at our disposal in the UK that can control the risk adequately. So that's not disagreeing with the outcome, it's the means to achieve it. Or actually we don't disagree ultimately with what the EU says. Now, I suspect in the vast proportion of cases, it's not going to be the case that we would take a fundamentally different view than the EU. Certainly, I think, in the technical space. So it will be that subtlety of what does it mean in practice in terms of alternatives, perhaps transition periods, scope. We did take a different approach on the analysis in our early bits of REACH on how to group, for example, PFAS as a way of prioritising. So in terms of that thinking and methodological approach, diverging from the EU for a particular reason. But having done that, for example, with firefighting foam, we're aligned with the EU on the definition for PFAS. So just in that quarter divergence, it depends on what lens you are looking at it. Is it going to be the outcomes and protections that we're seeking? I don't think we would disagree that what the EU is trying to do is not what the UK is trying to do. It's over what timescale and how best to get there. But as I say, in the vast proportion of cases, I suspect we will be close to, if not the same as the EU, and that's certainly where we are with firefighting foam restriction, is our proposals in terms of what to do and how to do it is no different at this point in time. It's merely the implementation date of when that's likely to come into effect.
Just I'm clear on that. So in terms of where you see divergence, it's largely likely to be around the timing, the process in terms of that implementation, rather than a divergence from the end point to where you want to get to.
I think if you look at it in REACH terms, agreed. If you look at it in terms of PFAS, I think a very different approach there from a generic single restriction for PFAS that currently the EU is working on. 5 member states, European Chemicals Agency, spending many years to say we want to restrict everything, and then them actually identifying in the process it actually is quite difficult to do that. So essential uses, there's 50 things already saying that may not apply, or indefinite transition periods. Whereas at the moment our thinking is start by tackling the things that are the priorities and build up to things and restrict. So there's a slightly different approach there in terms of philosophy. Do you aim to ban everything and then find perhaps you can't in some areas, or you build up a little bit more slowly or gradually in a prioritised way, knowing that you can take action.
Okay. And one final question, but you see that as, again, being a different approach as opposed to where the end point you want to get to. One is saying we should ban everything and some things will have to have exemptions to take because they're going to take longer. The other is we start by looking at them all individually and we build up to get to the end point where we ban them all eventually.
And I think in that it's the how you group them in terms of looking at the stages. So ultimately, I think better control, better prevention of exposure through regulatory means and REACH is an end destination, and obviously history will always judge have you ended up at exactly the same place. It's almost that approach of how to get there.
Thank you.
Thank you. Barry Gardner.
Thank you. I've been going through all the action points in the plan, and the question that sort of arises in my mind is, why are you prioritising measuring harm over preventing harm? Because virtually every action point is about if I go to the very start, continue to monitor and report annually, make the Environment Agency's multi-criteria geographic information system prioritisation map accessible, commission research to better understand, undertake further research, 1.7, 2.1, consider our approach towards further, it just, all of it seems to be about monitoring, and yet we have a huge body of evidence available to us from the EU, and instead of saying, let's look at this on a class-based basis, we are struggling to deal with one, which is the PFAS in firefighting foam.
I think with respect, the plan is DEFRA's plan, of which HSE is part.
Yes, but you said you broadly agreed with the plan earlier in responding to the chair. You said you'd been involved in every part of the implementation of the plan and you agreed with it. I mean, what are the elements of the plan then that you disagree with?
Sorry, if I can qualify what I said or intended to say. The bits in terms of our involvement are in relation to those specific actions assigned to HSE. The plan has many other actions for other regulators or other agencies who have the leads in those areas. So when I've supported the plan, that's in the context of HSE's input to those things that fall within our remit.
Well, is that part of the problem then, that actually what we're dealing with is people looking at this from their own perspective, you as one regulator, DEFRA as another regulator, and actually you can all be saying, well, my patch is all right, but nobody's joining this up to actually get something done to protect the public.
Can I come in at this point? So it's a very good point you're raising about the balance between advancing understanding, knowledge, and actually taking action. What I would say is that we are certainly taking that holistic look with DEFRA at chemicals and around, and at PFAS as group in particular. There are particular restrictions and a better evidence base around certain types of PFAS. So PFOA and PFOS, where the health evidence is much more advanced, they've been around longer, and therefore there are standards, there are restrictions around those certain types of PFAS. For other types of PFAS, and there are many, and this is an evolving picture and this is part of the complexity, it is important that we have a better understanding about what's out there in the environment. It's really important that we have a better understanding about how that's behaving in the environment. And so perhaps if I can just take a moment to describe the approach we're taking in the Environment Agency, not just to enhance our understanding, but what's the action we take as a result. So firstly, our approach to understanding is to take what's called a kind of non-targeted screening approach to try and detect what's out there in the environment. Now, that sounds quite straightforward. It's actually considered to be quite state-of-the-art, advanced.
Well, sorry,
yes,
I appreciate you're trying to explain this in context, but when you say find out what's out there, my understanding is that there are not just a few hundred, but tens of thousands of individual ones. And if you adopt a specific approach one by one, you'll never do it. And also, that would ignore that there's a cumulative effect that then resides in the soil or the water of the different ones all coming together.
Absolutely. So if I may just continue to describe the approach we're taking, which is building an evidence base that is understanding what is out there at a broad level, then understanding where is it present. That all informs then our very targeted monitoring. So we take very targeted monitoring samples across, thousands of locations. We then put that together with our understanding about the sources of PFAS, the different sectors, the intensity, and where do we think the risks are greatest. And we then do use that information to actually target the action. And we can explain in a little more detail some of the sectors that have been causing concern and why we have been focusing a lot of our regulatory effort on particular sites, so things like the firefighting foam, concerns about certain sectors like metal plating, textiles, paper and pulp, the waste sector. So we're using all of this intelligence to actually focus where our efforts and interventions are, because it's really important that we don't focus on one PFAS group to the exclusion of another. Does that help to explain the way in which we are targeting our action?
I think it raises a fundamental problem for me, which is that you're looking at where the problem exists,
yes,
rather than looking at how to stop the problem starting.
I think with respect we have to do both. Ultimately we need upstream action such as REACH, such as other restrictions under the either the Montreal Protocol or the Stockholm Convention. We need global action to take products and substances off the market. That is really, really important, because once it's out there in the environment, it's very challenging, absolutely, to tackle.
And if I could,
this year the EU is doing that, isn't it, on a class-based approach, but we're not.
well, if I could just come in terms of that, we are approaching it on a grouping. We're not doing it substance by substance. So the reason for the firefighting foam is that's the most prolific entry point. 48 tonnes a year go through the firefighting foam. So in terms of that upstream prevention part, for which HSE and REACH can input, it's tackling that, and that's what we are currently consulting on, with a view to there be restrictions that then come into place. So it is the combination of stopping things in the future, we're taking the targeting action to do those things that are biggest, and then working with the Environment Agency to see what else is there, because of course there are legacy issues, and that's where we do work together, and that's where the system has to work together, both on stopping things coming in but also deal what is already in the environment system.
Thank you very much. Ros Savage.
Thank you very much, Chair. Mr Daniels, you stay in the hot seat for a little bit longer. I've got 3 questions for you, but then you do get a little bit of a breather after that. So thank you very much for your patience. So the HSE is consulting at the moment on restricting PFAS in firefighting foam, as has already been mentioned. What level of evidence was it that triggered that consultation, that actually made that feel like an imperative and now is the time?
For firefighting foam?
For firefighting foam specifically.
We were asked by DEFRA, when we moved out of the EU into the situation, setting up REACH, where should we put effort? So they commissioned some working restrictions where the EU had already taken action. So lead in ammunition, which recently, relatively recently, we've done work on restrictions there in the proposals, and tattoo inks and permanent makeup. In terms of permanent makeup. So those are 2 pieces of work that we were asked to do specifically as the priorities that we completed. Those have been accepted by DEFRA, who are taking those forward. So not to digress, but 2 restrictions, work in progress. Alongside that, the issue of PFAS clearly was in the domain. So the way to approach that was we were asked to do what is termed a regulatory management options analysis, which says look at PFAS because it is so big, because it is one of those very complex, wicked problems to approach, and work out how to get from A to B. So as a result of that regulatory management options analysis, where we work with the Environment Agency, other regulators, and get the best information, it was identified the first place to start, the critical place to start, was with firefighting foam. Recommendation that we need to work across the various government departments and agencies and work collectively in this, and DEFRA can no doubt talk to that, but clearly the PFAS plan is a manifestation of that happening in practice and keeping doing that. And then we identified other areas where, having done firefighting foam, we would next move to. So that was an issue that had been emerging, clearly when we were part of the EU, having now set ourselves up the agency, not just for PFAS, but for other harmful and hazardous chemicals or substances, dealing with those where there was a health or environmental impact, then start making inroads into PFAS. So that was the journey to get us where we are. So in terms of the evidence, it was the analysis that we needed to do. Clearly we had some information we could draw on from the EU, but we need to look at that ourselves. So that risk assessment to meet the requirements of the legislation is, what's the problem, how big, are there alternatives, impacts, are all of the things that we've been doing our work on that is in that public consultation now, that ends in 2 weeks' time. We will then be taking any comments that we've received to develop then the formal recommendation. So we've already started consulting on transitional periods, etc. But before we get to a final end point, we have to know if the firefighting foam were to be restricted that contains PFAS, are there alternatives? There are in some areas. Are they viable? And how long would sectors need to move to a PFAS-free firefighting foam environment? Our current proposals range from taking some actions 6 months as a transitional period from when the law would come into effect, and up to 10 years, the longer time being for some of the very high hazard chemical plants, for example, where the efficacy of alternatives needs to be demonstrated and proven. So we have that pathway, and we are delivering the plan to the time scale that we are able to deliver.
Thank you. Just as an aside, it seems from our visit to a firefighting foam manufacturer that there are viable alternatives, and they're mostly now working on clearing up the legacy toxicity on their side.
And certainly for many of the small scales in the foam, yes, there are alternatives, and some being used worldwide. So the challenge is how do you move from one tried and tested foams that work and get that across the sector with the confidence that it is going to work, particularly at that major hazard end. But in our proposals for, if you like, general use of firefighting foam, the transitional period of 18 months is what we're sort of currently thinking of. So a relatively short cutover period, but clearly having to make sure that the country is still equipped, and firefighters and fire brigades and fire rescue services have the right tools to use when they're needed.
So actually that brings me nicely on to my second question, which is whether that decision on restricting PFAS in firefighting foam is likely to be implemented in line with the EU restriction coming into effect.
Just in terms of timing, we will be after the EU. Depending on how fast the legislation comes in, it may be 1 or 2 years behind. It really does depend on where we are. REACH does set out in law fixed periods, for example, for public consultation, etc. So we do have to go through a process, but we are aiming to get our final recommendation to DEFRA to them by the end of this calendar year. That's what we are aiming for.
Okay. Thank you. And final question, which I think you've probably already touched on. You mentioned that you're going to, once you have dealt with the firefighting foam as being the highest priority, you'll then be looking at other consumer products. Will you be looking at a similar sort of level of evidence needed for that as on firefighting foam?
In terms of the evidence, I mean, the starting point is REACH and its requirements, which is, there is a risk that isn't adequately controlled. How helpful is that? It says a risk, and is it adequately controlled? But then it does break down a little bit further. So that threshold is what we're going to have to make a decision on. Clearly, where the EU have reached a technical bit, and certain things we could say yes because of the knowledge of areas of PFAS, and this is where you do take a grouping approach of how do you divide the PFAS cake, as it were, up, where to concentrate the effort. Then saying, well, if there are alternatives that are suitable, adequate to perform that function, or that function isn't needed, and a restriction is the way to do it, and it is practical and can be enforced, then we could move as quickly as the law would allow us to move to get to the conclusion to say that these things now should be restricted, or at least a proposal. There are some areas, and again, I think this is the conversation we have to have with DEFRA and the consultation building out, is saying, but we know already there are some PFAS where there are no alternatives, but they are in use and critical, so in some areas of health, some areas of net zero, etc. And that's where the EU is getting to problems, saying actually there are no alternatives, or if there are, they may be worse than the one we have already. So that's the fine art of trying to work our way through, at the moment, what is quite a large, wicked problem to navigate our way through.
Can I just ask a quick supplementary question to that? Clearly, 100 years ago, we didn't used to have PFAS, so we used to manage to conduct civilised life without PFAS. So what sort of things do you have in mind when you say that there may be some things where there is no acceptable substitute?
I think it's one of those, and clearly come right after the event, but in terms of some uses, the PFAS now, because technology has moved on and how they function, isn't easily changed. So if you take it, for example, in terms of waterproofing of clothing, then yes, we will have, there are alternatives. So those areas may be much more readily amenable to replacement. In some of the more specialised or technical areas, it may not be as easy. So almost you would require technology to play catch up, to say what is the alternatives that may not exist at this moment, but could become viable. There are other areas where actually, say, REACH may not be the best way to tackle these. So other regulations that we have in terms of, say, biocidal control or pesticides, etc., we can regulate in different ways. What the thing actually the EU has said in that is they are maybe talking about sectors and those essential uses where there is no answer at the moment of, yes, we will ban, but at the moment it will have an indefinite transition period. And if you work through the consequences of that, that is, you need to carry on doing what you have until such time as there's something better. But that's the level of detail we're going to have to get into, to say there are clearly areas where we can take action and recommend that to government, and there are some other areas that's going to be a little bit more tricky. But what we need to do is make progress where we can.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Manuela Pertucala.
Thank you, Chair. So the committee has heard evidence that suggests that total and non-targeted PFAS monitoring methods can reveal that up to 90% of PFAS may be undetected using just targeted monitoring methods. And the question is for Liz. So obviously the Environment Agency uses a mixture or a combination of both methods. How do you decide what PFAS to target for the monitoring following the non-targeted screening?
Okay, thank you. Let me start by explaining the approach, and then I'll perhaps pass to Matt on the detail of that. So you're right, we use a combination. It's not one or the other. The non-targeted screening is to work out what might be present in the environment. The targeted then is getting to at what levels and where, and then we can move to very much more targeted, quantitative monitoring as opposed to screening. And it's that monitoring that we need to actually, understand at what levels and where, and therefore what are the sources that we think we need to target. So that's a kind of general description of the approach. Perhaps if I ask Matt to give a couple of examples of that.
Yes, so the Environment Agency is building its expertise up on that, what we call the fully quantitative analysis. So this is where we're looking for a very specific PFAS, and we want to know pretty much exactly how much is in the environment. And this is used to sort of inform our regulation as well. So we need to understand what individual PFAS are, and particularly the ones that are, where there is science and evidence that shows they're more harmful. So we're looking at those to try and identify the sources, try and manage those as well through our regulation. The other thing is that if you zoom right out and you said, all right, let's look at total PFAS load is in there. What we've done a comparison of that, so we know sort of the whole volume of PFAS in that stretch of river, and then compared that with the individual PFAS we're looking at. And we think we're capturing about 80% of the load. That's in terms of quantity of PFAS. It's not in individual PFAS. So that additional 20% will be your thousands that aren't being detected. The other really critical point here is how these PFAS behave in the environment. So we know that they are incredibly persistent, but many PFAS will break down, some within days, some within months, to what we call these arrowhead substances. So these are the ones that we're really looking for. So they will break down, but to form other PFAS, and so we're really focused on monitoring those. So it is a sort of combination using both tools that can sort of support each other and develop our science. And we are doing more on work in the coming year on total load of PFAS as well.
Thank you. And I want to stay within the kind of monitoring framework. Does the Environment Agency consider that the lack of environmental standards for many PFAS to be a barrier to effective monitoring? And if so, would constraints on, for example, lab infrastructure or resources prevent the use of non-targeted PFAS monitoring in your view?
Thank you. So again, if I start off on that, it's really important to have standards so we know what we're aiming for. And at the moment, there's only one statutory standard, environmental quality standard on water, and one for biota for PFAS. And that is a challenge not just for monitoring, but in terms of those that want to develop, say, clean-up technology. Yeah. You need to know what you're aiming for. So we think that is a gap. What we are doing, in fact, what some research we published last week is setting out thresholds for PFAS based on health limits. So although we're kind of still working out how best to apply these, we thought it's important to share this emerging evidence and the approach we're taking, again, so that we can give industry an indication of where they need to head, as well as how we can actually apply this in practice through our permits. So we're sharing the evolving science and continuing to have that discussion about what is the best way then to use that to set limits. It's a real challenge when those standards don't exist, and although I've referenced the one environmental quality standard around water, there's no international limits for air or soil, and it is very challenging to regulate in that space. Did you want to add any colour on that, Marc?
I just want to be absolutely certain about the question as well, because within the analysis and the monitoring, we use the word standard to sort of refer to thresholds, as Liz is talking about, but also in terms of a laboratory standard. So if we're looking at, we want to know how much of PFAS X is in the environment, we want to be very specific on the actual quantities, we need to have a standard which is the pure substance of that PFAS X to be able to compare that to. So this is why it takes time to develop the sort of the laboratory techniques that we now sample for 67 individual PFAS. So you need to have that information. So that's the other term that's standard. So I just wanted to make sure there wasn't any confusion there in terms of standards used for thresholds.
Thank you.
Very much indeed. We come now to John Whitby.
Thank you, Chair. Question to Ms Parks. The PFAS plan commits to new guidance for legacy PFAS. What approaches to PFAS remediation does the EA consider to be effective, and how is cost factored into assessing which methods are viable? Presumably they're all expensive.
So remediating land is very, very tricky because, as I said, there are no standards for PFAS in soil or indeed in air, and it's challenging in water as well. There's a number of mechanisms that exist for guiding the clean-up of land, and traditionally we have the Part 2A contaminated land sector that's been in place for quite a long time, but increasingly actually land clean-up is kind of being tackled through the planning process. And what's really important there, I think something like 90% of contaminated land clean-up is now addressed through the planning process. What's important there is it's clean up to the standard of the new use of the land rather than what was it being used for at the time, which is what the Part 2A process will apply to. The threshold evidence that we put out last week is part of the work we're doing to try and guide how do you set standards, say not just to monitor, but so that the clean-up industries know what they're aiming at. It's particularly tricky to do, and there are no technologies at the moment that will necessarily achieve the required standard. I'm told, and in fact you've taken evidence from parties that have said these are evolving all the time. Again, Matt, if you want to add a bit of colour about what's actually happening in practice out there.
Yeah, so obviously the remediation that might be necessary for some historic contamination would usually be done on a case-by-case basis. So in some cases, contamination isn't going anywhere, there's no route of exposure, so the safest thing at the moment might be to leave it there to make sure that you don't open those exposure pathways. In terms of remediation, there are technologies that are developing, and I think when we've spoken to the companies that are sort of trying to push that technology onto the market, what they need is some certainty around the sort of future, and they will innovate. The science is emerging, and then the technology is also following. So we're very interested to continue to work with stakeholders like that to improve the sort of what we can do with treating PFAS.
Do we need a reinstated contaminated land fund in order to support the cost of PFAS remediation?
I mean, I think the contaminated land regime is an effective mechanism, and it starts by working with who the various parties could be that are the polluter, and then working out what's needed to actually achieve a level of clean-up. There's also been some very good work done by CLARE, which is the body that kind of sets the kind of guidance, I guess, for the sector, to try and come up with something that's practical so the sector knows what it's aiming at. But you're rightly saying, the challenge of how that is actually paid for, that continues to be a challenge, and we know there is now a new fund out there for Pathfinder projects, which allows people to innovate and see what is possible for different types of site. So a lot of this is quite cutting edge, and we're going to need to keep working, supporting local authorities as we do on sites to kind of help with the site-by-site decisions until some of those standards and those principles emerge, which is what's needed.
And in terms of removed PFAS, are we going to be able to destroy all removed PFAS given the limited capacity of high temperature incineration in the UK?
Again, this is a challenge because the various treatment techniques, whether you're looking at waste, at sludge, at soil, ultimately, you know, the residues have got to go somewhere, and you've then got a much more contaminated set of residues. So at the moment, you're right, it's the high temperature incineration that exists, and we've varied the permits of the high temperature incinerators to make sure that they are operating at a sufficiently high temperature, so 1100 degrees, to actually destroy the PFAS in there. So I think now on the back of the plan, now the plan's published and sets out the direction of travel, this gives something for the various sectors to look at and see where the evolving markets might be. You know, at the moment it's the high temperature incineration, it's the long-term storage, it's those kind of options. And I think setting those standards will allow the sector to evolve and develop the technology.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I think Barry wants to come in briefly.
Ms. Parks, you talked about the plan there, but and you talked about costs. The Environment Agency has estimated the cost to clean up the PFAS problem sites, and they said that just to clean up those problem sites alone could cost between 31 and 121 billion, didn't it? And yet the plan makes no mention at all of costs, and presumably these are things that will ultimately devolve onto the taxpayer.
I mean, funding the work, I can only comment on the funding to us as a regulator, but funding and the kind of polluter pays principle, you know, is a big challenge.
Yeah.
You know, in some countries, and indeed, you know, back
the art of litotes is not yet dead.
Yes, indeed. I mean, the principle is right that those that derive the benefit should pay the cost. It's very challenging when products are being put on the market that were legitimate, and then subsequently the evidence proves that there's a challenge. So I think the thing is, it's.
Why does the action plan say nothing about this? It's supposed to be an action plan.
I'm afraid I can only comment on the actions in the plan that fall to the Environment Agency. I can't make decisions about public funding, I'm sorry.
Thank you very much. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. Firstly, to Ms Parks, if it's okay, I've got a couple of questions about permitting. Could you outline the Environment Agency's current approaches to PFAS discharge limits in environmental permits?
Thank you. So we are taking the monitoring data that I've talked about earlier, and we're putting that with the various work that we've been doing to understand where the biggest problem sectors are. I think I've already mentioned that we are focusing on, in addition to the airport sector, textiles, paper and pulp, metal finishing, and waste as examples of where we think the greatest risks are. And we are then working with those operators. Many, when they understand what may be happening, will take action on their own initiative. A number of years ago, we started the process of modifying permits to require them to undertake monitoring, to actually understand what is happening at that site. But you'll appreciate this is quite a time-consuming process. It's a bespoke process to actually understand what are the sources and pathways at that site, what types of PFAS, and so working with those operators, and where we need to, we will then be taking action to modify the permits. So it is challenging, the absence, as I say, in the absence of statutory standards. We don't have what would be called best available technique limits that you would normally expect associated with these sectors. These substances will have been used and released lawfully. And now we are working with them on a site-by-site basis to take the action that's needed. So that does take time. It does impose a burden on the operator as well to do their own monitoring. And I would like to be able to speed that process up. But, there are finite limits on things like lab capacity around the whole of the country, not just for the Environment Agency. Some of this is very tricky. It takes time. It takes resources. So what we're wanting to do is target those where we can have most impact, not trying to do everything everywhere, but coming back to the use of the monitoring, the screening, to work out where we can be most impactful. And then we want to share all of the approaches. So we have this kind of risk screening approach, this very effective risk screening tool that the plan refers to, and we want to be able to make that available to other regulators and other public bodies so that we can all be sharing that intelligence and making sure we don't have the problem moved around between different environmental compartments. So it's focusing where we can have most impact. I should just say that some of the challenges also arise in relation to things like closed landfills. And we're looking at a cross-sector of open and closed landfills. It's a sector that I've known for many years, and understanding what is emerging and where is it emerging. Not only is it present in the waste, but it will be present in the leachate, and it's also going to be present in the landfill gas. So we're working very collaboratively with the sectors to get a better understanding of that and to work out what's the best way, as Matt has already said, of is it about containment, is it about control, is it about removal, because you can't just tanker that leachate off-site and expect the problem to go away. You then need to make sure that your downstream works has got the ability to deal with it. And this is where the Environment Agency can take that holistic view, looking across different sectors and different media, and focus on where we can have most impact.
Very helpful and comprehensive answer, but coming back to resources, I think that's a key question here. It sounds like you're having to use water capacity you have quite sparingly at the moment, given the size of the sectors involved. What support does the Environment Agency need to actually enforce limits on PFAS emissions into the environment? Is there a big gap in your ability to do what your ambitions would be compared to the resources that you've got?
Thank you. What we do is take a thoughtful approach, and that's underpinned by very sophisticated monitoring and analysis and regulatory experience. And I referred earlier to the kind of multidisciplinary team that I have that works across our organisation with other partner regulators. At the moment, as I say, we're very relying on granting aid to do this work, and it's really important that we can make that as targeted as possible. It doesn't all fall to us. We are the regulator, and as I said earlier, where we can, we will be requiring operators to do their own monitoring. We also work incredibly closely with the water industry, for instance, through the chemical investigation programme, which has been going on since 2010, and that's all about how do we better understand this as it moves through the environment. The water industry has been looking at PFOA and PFOS for well over a decade now. A lot of focus on sludge and what are the better treatment options. So there are lots of examples of where sectors are taking responsibility for understanding the challenges. Your question specifically about enforcement, the principle of environmental regulation then is that we should be able to recover all of our costs, and it's important this is a part of the overall regulatory cost. I think we've still got some way to go to make sure that this can be sustainable in the longer term, and it is incredibly challenging to set standards in the absence of statutory standards. The threshold work is quite cutting edge that we published last week, and we're hoping that will prompt a dialogue about the best way to apply this.
Final question, just on self-monitoring. The EA relies on self-monitoring in a range of different areas, water being one. Are you confident in that as a regime to monitor, or do you think that the EA should monitor more things and issues themselves directly?
Thank you. We undertake a vast range of monitoring. What's important to me is what we do with that information, and that's deriving information from all sorts of sources, not just that we produce ourselves. We are undertaking a transformation of our overall monitoring programme. We need to make sure that what we do is as effective as possible, that we do draw on and make the best use of all the science and evidence that is out there, and that we make best use of the advancing technologies, so that we don't keep looking for things. If we know they're there, what's that going to tell us? It's important that we understand trends, for instance, and seasonal changes. So we're trying to all the time better refining what we do to look for the things that we don't yet understand, as opposed to just gathering more information. And I think with the publication of the plan, it is this, I wouldn't describe it as a tipping point, but I think now we've got that direction of travel set out by government, with the 3 strands in there of firstly improving understanding, secondly tackling the pathways, and thirdly reducing exposure. For me, it's now about how we use this information to drive action, because that's what everyone needs to see to protect communities and the environment.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, Mr Daniels, Ms Parks and Mr Womersley, thank you very much indeed for your evidence today and for all that you've done in preparation for this event. We'll bring this first panel to a close now. This sitting is suspended. Order.
Thank you.
Thank you.
to order. Well, welcome back everybody to the second panel event in today's inquiry into PFAS, the final session. I'm delighted to say that we have joining us Minister Emma Hardy and Mr Casale from the Department of Environment, Food and Rural Affairs. In terms of the questions we ask, they'll all be directed to you, Minister, but obviously if you feel it would be best passed on to your colleague, we'll leave you to decide on that. So can I start by thanking you and your officials for timely publication of the PFAS plan yesterday and for providing a draft version of your thoughts early to the committee to help inform our preparation. We announced our review into PFAS in April of last year, and we were delighted to hear that the government were producing their own response to this important issue. And we very much welcome the constructive dialogue with this committee and the support for our work that you and your department have provided, and the way in which we work together on the timing of this meeting and the plan, which is very much appreciated indeed. However, it won't have escaped your attention that the response to the document has been at best lukewarm. A Guardian report quoted Chloe Alexander, the chemicals policy lead at Wildlife and Countryside Link, describing it as a crushingly disappointing framework that ducks the hard decisions, and also quoted Shubhi Sharma, a scientific researcher at ChemTrust, saying that action has been deferred to an indefinite date in the future. Were you surprised that the reaction to the action plan has been so negative, and can you see why experts in the field were expecting more?
Thank you so much for having me today, and thanks for also sort of raising this as an issue around the problems that we have around PFAS, and I look forward to working in collaboration with your committee. When it comes to the plan, I am very proud of the plan. I mean, obviously I'm not here to speak for the previous government's action or inaction, but I'll talk for mine. This has never been done before. This has never been done in government before. Have they taken a cross-government collaborative approach to looking at how do we deal with sources, how do we deal with pathways, how do we deal with exposures? And that's exactly what this PFAS plan is intended to do. Now, I'm obviously going to sit here and say, you know, we've perfected it first time, and I welcome and engage with environmental groups, with yourself and with others to say, okay, this is the first time we've ever done something. And to be honest with you, Chair, I think the first time you ever try and do anything, you're going to get some criticism from people saying you should have done it in a different way. And I'm willing to sort of take that on and listen to it and learn and understand on, okay, so I'm hearing that, hearing some of the points. So in which ways would you want to see more work? Where would you want to see more improvement? But I have to say, being, you know, as a Labour government, taking this issue seriously, looking for the first time at developing something that's cross-government, and I'm pleased that we've done that. And this is a foundation, and this will build, and where there are areas where we need to develop on it, we will. Where there's areas where we think we've got it right first time, we'll crack on with it. But I think that's how I kind of see this. And I think sometimes, you know, what's the phrase, perfect is the enemy of the good. You know, I wanted to get something out. I want to demonstrate this government's commitment and seriousness to this issue, and that's what we've done.
Now, I mean, you talk about the fact this is the first time that the UK government has produced a plan on this, but I mean, we weren't landing on the moon. There are other nations across Europe who maybe have been ahead of us over the course of previous years. So it wasn't like the steps that might be considered were entirely unknown and hadn't been tried elsewhere. Now, when launching the plan, you said that PFAS posed a long-term challenge for not only our health, but that of the nation's vital ecosystems, and that government would act decisively to reduce their harmful effects. However, my sense on initial reading and some of the criticisms are that this is primarily a plan to consult on whether to have a plan, really. It falls a long way short of the coordinated action that the EU is taking collectively, or the further steps that have been taken in countries like France or Denmark. Many of the recommendations were to consider action or to consult on action, and obviously consulting or improving monitoring are important, but it can't really be described as decisive action, can it?
I'm not going to, I think it's a good thing that we listen to experts. under this government. I think it's a good thing that we have research, that we have information, that we take knowledge in, and we recognise where there's expertise, we should listen to it and we should learn from it and understand it. But I also think it's a good thing under this government that we're having an EU reset at the moment. I think it's a good thing that we're developing a relationship much closer with the European Union. And there are certain aspects, so pesticides being for one of them, are in scope of the sort of EU negotiations that are happening sort of at the moment. But when I came into this role and sort of had a look at the system as it was in front of me, it was quite clear that the system as it stands at the moment, and I'll talk how we intend to change it, was that to restrict chemicals at the moment is a 2 to 3 year process per one, because of the whole process of which you've got to go around to actually introduce it. The previous government, from leaving the EU, initiated 2 restrictions, so one looking at lead in ammunition, the other one looking at tattooing. So they started that work in 2021 and never made a decision on it, sort of just left it. So when we came in, the first thing I wanted to do is, right, what are the decisions that are, where are the issues that are waiting for a decision, which we did, lead in ammunition, got rid of that one straight away. We initiated the consultation into firefighting foam, we did the work on tattoo inks as well, but also, how can we change the system? Because if we don't change the system, we are forever going to be behind the European Union. Now, we're not rejoining the European Union. We're not here to sort of talk about that. What we're talking about, and as it was sort of illustrated before, is how can we look at the system that they have while maintaining our own control over what, obviously works for our country, but how can we look at the system they have to move through these processes much more quickly? And we know that for many industries, what they want is that certainty, what they want is that sort of level playing field, what they want is to sort of understand that when they're exporting and importing, the rules are going to be similar. So we can really speed this up. And what I want to do under
I mean, if I can just stop you there, because I think we want to get into some of the approach that you're taking and providing that certainty. I wanted to ask you about the basis of the plan. The plan states that it was devised having regard to the environmental principles policy statement. That statement includes both the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle. We already know many of the harms associated with many PFAS. And this comes on to your point about stopping a couple and other ones cropping up. Yet there is a lack of scientific certainty about the harms of every specific compound. We heard from some witnesses that a government applying a precautionary principle would assume that all PFAS are problematic until they're proven otherwise or are derogated in special circumstances because of their essential use. Now, the plan doesn't propose doing that. The polluter pays principle would entail the manufacturers of PFAS contributing towards remediating the harms from PFAS pollution, which are evident and costly. Again, your plan doesn't propose that. So can you explain how this plan applies the precautionary principle and the polluter pays principle as laid out in that policy statement?
Well, as it sort of mentions in the plan as well, we are looking very carefully at other jurisdictions and how they do that. And as I was sort of trying to explain, I'll try again, is that the system at the moment that we have is laborious and slow and takes an awful long time to put any chemicals into restriction. So we need to change the system. And that's what I want to do. And the reason why that matters so much was if we change the system, we can quickly catch up with the European Union and look at sort of adding more things onto the candidate list and the authorisation list by the end of this year going into next year. So it really matters the way that the system is at the moment. But there are essential uses of PFAS, and I hear what people are saying, that you should, ban them all. But I think, as was illustrated by the gentleman that spoke before me, is you have the European Union saying, right, okay, we're going to ban them all, and then actually we need that one, it's an essential one, so we'll have an indefinite transition period for that one, or we'll move that one. We're doing it sort of bottom up, sort of grassroots up, and having a look at where they're essential use. And I do want to stress the importance of the essential use. To give you an example, protective clothing used by our armed forces at the moment and emergency services. There is evidence of PFAS there. There isn't currently an alternative, and I'm happy to talk about research and development and how you develop alternatives later on. Medical devices, catheters, implants, there are at the moment essential use of PFAS. And I want to be really, really careful, especially when we're thinking about use in the Ministry of Defence, use by our armed forces, use in aerospace as well, where we're seeing evidence of PFAS, that we are making the best choices for our country. and that is looking at where there's an essential use until there's an alternative. And as I say, I can speak to research and development. Until there's an alternative, we do need to carry on using this. And I think that's recognised by the EU with how they've gone, yes, we'll ban it all, but then actually indefinite transition for this one, indefinite transition for that one. And so they've approached it in a different way, but I anticipate we'll end up in a similar place.
But, I mean, what you said a moment ago that you're wanting to change the whole system that you inherited, and one way to change that system will be to start by saying we're banning, and then we will consider if there are particular reasons why a certain one shouldn't be banned, which is broadly the approach the EU's taken. And now, having said that you want to change the system and get away from that, you now seem to be making a virtue of starting from the bottom and banning one at a time as we're going, which is what has been criticised. And, we heard evidence that new PFAS are coming onto the market all the time. We learned about regrettable substitution, where one PFAS is banned, they've very marginally changed the compound. Now we've got to go through the process of banning that. So, I mean, are you changing the system, or are you arguing for carrying on broadly with an approach that says, let's only ban it once we've proved it's really harmful?
We are changing the system when it comes to UK REACH, absolutely. So we're changing the way that in which we identify and restrict the use of certain chemicals for UK REACH. So we are changing that system, and that will make it quicker and easier for us to add chemicals to the authorisation list or restriction list. So we are doing that. What I'm saying with the PFAS is that we have taken an approach that is evidence-led, that is scientific-led, that is expert-led, and I absolutely think that's the right thing to do, to listen to experts in this field. We've taken an approach which looks and identifies where we don't want the unintended consequences of going forward and saying, yes, we're going to ban all of these, and then finding out this is going to impact our military. I don't want that to happen. So I think
if you had a precautionary approach, it absolutely understands there will be some things that there are exceptions that you're making, and you say about scientific evidence you've heard, but there are many scientific experts who are criticising this approach, and they're precisely saying that if you try and ban things individually as you're going, you'll constantly find that the changes that the sector makes outpace you. So, I mean, isn't that approach that they've got in the EU one that would be understandable for all manufacturing? The products they make in the UK will be exactly the same as they make in Europe. I mean, isn't that the sort of area of least resistance?
I've probably, again, not explained well enough. We're not going to ban individual PFAS. There's different ways of grouping them. And if perhaps, Marc, with the scientific knowledge, if you could sort of explain how the different ones are grouped, I think that might help illustrate. Because we're not talking, because there's thousands of them, about an individual one. But Marc, you want to sort of explain?
And definitely, I mean, a general approach of seeing what decisions the EU has made and then drawing from them. And as you've pointed out, Chair, the EU is in the process of making a decision in relation to a universal PFAS restriction. We're going to find out, we think, later this year what that's going to involve. And then in light of that, we can decide what we're doing here, obviously whilst retaining full control for that decision. So we may well end up in the same position, but we're too early to say that just yet. But in relation to grouping, I think in the earlier session there was reference to the Health and Safety Executive's regulatory management options analysis. And there was a very full analysis in the front of that analysis around an approach to grouping of PFAS. So I know that some people say, well, why don't you take all PFAS as a complete group and apply a universal ban to them without going into the details? But in fact, there are definitely differences within PFAS as a category. Even the OECD definition that we take, even the OECD points to there being different groupings. The RMOA pointed out that there's a sort of higher level distinction you can draw between polymeric and non-polymeric PFAS. And in fact, there are about sort of 4 or 5 pages at the front of the RMA which go into different groupings. So really what we want to do is to make sure that when we ban one particular chemical, as you said, we don't have regrettable substitution to something which is similar to it, but also, given the different risks, and those risks apply at the different stages. So we take a life cycle approach, thinking first of all about production and then usage, and then what happens at the waste end of the life cycle. Different risks apply at different stages of the life cycle for different PFAS groupings. So we do want to take an evidence-based, science-based approach, which is drawn from the facts, which does imply that one size doesn't fit all. But coming back to the first point, we will wait and see what the EU restriction, universal restriction, ends up looking like.
Thank you. Barry Gardner.
Yes. Minister, a comprehensive restriction doesn't mean an immediate ban. As the Chair has pointed out, the EU model explicitly allows for time-limited derogations. So what you said about, what industry wants, industry's quite happy at the moment, aren't they? Because they're getting away with not having to pay for the clean-up costs. They're getting to keep on modifying every time we bat one. It's whack-a-mole, isn't it? We bat one down and they simply modify the compound and another one pops up. So this whole approach of sort of wait and watch, PFAS are already in our blood. They're in our water. They're in our children's bodies. The number of hotspots are already in the tens of thousands, and we know and we've said that they're going to increase. So you have not yet, I think, persuaded anyone on this committee that this is adopting a precautionary approach. But let me tackle what Mr. Casale said about the new approach that you're adopting to REACH. That's on pages 15, 16 and 17 of the plan. And what you talk about there is on page 15, the UK REACH candidate list indicates publicly if a substance has properties of very high concern, sending an important signal to encourage consideration of substitution away from particularly hazardous substances. Now, the candidates list is not actually about banning, is it? When you talk about the candidates list in REACH, that indicates if the substance has those properties of high concern. But you're only sending, as you say, a signal. And in the same paragraph, you say, we're currently considering the addition of further specific, not class, not group, specific PFAS substances to it. Now, there's a problem there for two reasons. The candidate list is not the authorization list, which bans substances, but it's the lower tier list of raising the substances as being of high concern. And the wording specific substances would suggest that the government isn't looking at group bans along the same lines as we've already discussed.
Okay, so yes, you're right. So the candidate list is a list of chemicals that we have high concern about. Now, this is where I differ from the previous government. So the previous government were only looking to consider putting things on the candidate list if they were there going to move it into the authorisation list. And what this has meant, in effect, since we've left the European Union to the point we came into government, is that the EU have added 42 onto the candidate list and the UK added 0.
Yeah.
So in my mind, I think the candidate list has an important role to play in its own right of saying and signalling to people these are areas of concern. And by the reforms that we're looking at doing with UK REACH, that means that we can catch up at looking at sort of these chemicals that have been added by the EU by sort of the end of next year. Now, the authorisation list, which of course is when you sort of limit that to tough conditions, again, since the left Brexit and under the previous government, the EU added 5, we added 0, which is why in July 25 last year, we committed to reviewing all of the substances that have been added by the EU to the authorisation list since the UK exit, and we're looking at consulting and recommending another 3 of those, calling for evidence on the remaining 2. So all the time, I think that the message that I hope that you're hearing from me is I am absolutely determined we are not going to be the dirty man of Europe under my watch. And where the EU have gone ahead and moved more quickly with us on some of these actions, I am finding ways in which we can do exactly the same. And on the restriction list, again, EU have added 8 since exit, we've added 0. We've already started to take action on that. We've already started to look at restrictions. So what I would like to be able to come back and talk to you about if I was invited back again to discuss this sort of next year is how far we've got in making sure that we're catching up with the European Union on these different things. Because I do think, and I can say this as a politician, I do think it's fairly disgraceful that we've been allowed to fall behind since EU exit up until this point, and I am quite determined that won't continue.
On page 9 of your plan, it says we expect to see progress through combination of improved public understanding, industry-led and industry-owned initiatives, such as the Chemical Industries Associations, PFAS Information Exchange Forum, and transparent self-regulation. So on the one hand, you're putting the responsibility on the industry, and yes, you're indicating or you're signalling to them that these are now of high concern, these specific ones. And on the other hand, you're putting the responsibility on the consumer. If you read the back of a shampoo bottle, how are you supposed to know that polyfluoroalkyl phosphate, and polytetrafluoroethylene are forever chemicals that we shouldn't be putting on our heads? To put this onto the consumer and to say that we're signalling to the industry that these are of high concern, all the time you're saying to industry, you keep on going and doing what you like until we tell you you can't. And we're telling you it's of concern, but the responsibility is on you. But the costs are on us. And if you look at what the EU have calculated in terms of their costs, the Environment Agency, and we heard it from Ms. Parks earlier, the Environment Agency has already estimated cleaning up the problem sites at between 31 and 121 billion pounds. Right? The EU is saying that if they put a ban on PFAS, then the costs of our healthcare in Europe would fall by 39 billion pounds a year. So all of the burden of this at the moment is falling on the public. The risks are falling on the public. The health detriment is falling on the public, the costs are falling on the public, and I can't for the life of me understand why industry is being given a free pass, exactly as the chair says, and there's no polluter pays principle and there's no precautionary principle being applied.
I'm sorry, I disagree with you. I think the candidate list...
What element of that do you disagree with, Minister?
Happy to
the
explain.
Costs?
Happy to
because
explain.
The costs have been
published. The answer. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. Putting chemicals on the candidate list is not a mere signal to the industry. Putting chemicals on the candidate list is more than a mere signal that we might do something about it.
That's what you said it is. You said it was a signal. It's there on page 9 of your report.
It designates a substance of very high concern. So I'll push back gently on that. When it comes to the EU funding, again, I do want to sort of reiterate to the committee that it's this government that increased funding to the EU by £188 million this year, after the previous government slashed it dramatically down to its lowest level ever after the election in 2010, only to allow it to recover in the early 2020s. So it is this government that is putting money into the Environment Agency to make sure it has the money to fulfil its function. So I won't, and I know for a fact you're not saying that, Barry. Sort of listen to people criticise what this government's doing when it comes to funding the Environment Agency. And on the sort of, polluter pays, we absolutely adhere to the fact that the polluter pays. I mean, that is a cornerstone of what we've done and a cornerstone of what I personally have done when it comes to the water industry. So you can use Part 2 of the Environmental Protection Act 1990, which means that those responsible for historic land contamination have to pay for the remediation. Where it's unable to find it because it's a legacy contamination and therefore it's incredibly difficult, there's £80 million fund which is available for local government to be able to use this. And you're right to feel angry that it shouldn't land on the public to pay for this, and I share that anger with you because I think that's absolutely right. So where we can identify where this has come from, of course we go after the polluter. We're doing it in water, we'll do it in this. Where we can't, we have had to set up a separate fund of it. But what the plan is looking at as well is dealing with the sources. And that's looking at where we can research into alternatives, where we can move elsewhere, what is happening in other jurisdictions, what action are we taking. Now, I'm not going to sit here and defend, nor do I want to, what the previous government did or didn't do. But what I can say in the 18 months since I've come in is these are all the actions I'm taking. This is how I want to catch up with the European Union. This is the money that we're putting into the Environment Agency, and these are the changes that I want to see happen. And in some cases, industry is doing a good job. The cosmetics industry is doing a really good job in leading the way on this. They are actually one of the best industries that's sort of showing the way on doing this, and I think that's great. So I think where you have industry working well, let's celebrate it. Where you have people not behaving the way you do, let's suffer the consequences through the polluter pays. I feel that's a fair way of doing it.
Okay, well, we'll maybe come back to some of that, but Samuel Wilson.
Minister, you've already maybe touched on some of the answers to the first question I want to ask, but the plan states that UK REACH will be reformed by 2028 to be more aligned with the closest trading partners, and that the UK will use trusted jurisdiction decisions as starting points. How exactly will those commitments work in practical ways?
Sorry, excuse me. Right, do you want to explain all of this in detail? Thanks, Marc.
So if I sort of explain where we are with the REACH restrictions process, and obviously these basically will be where we ban substances. We've just been speaking about the universal REACH restriction that's in the pipeline. So currently we've inherited the same processes that apply to EU REACH. And what that means is that, and the agency just explained this as well, but what this means is that for the first 12 months after DEFRA commissions the HSE to look into doing a REACH restriction, there's a sort of an Annex 15 dossier stage whereby the HSE has to undertake lots of assessments and pull together a sort of proposal based on the sort of scientific facts. That, under the regulations, then has to be subject to a 6-month consultation period. Following that 6 months, there's another 3-month period where the HSE looks into the socio-economic impacts of what might be their future proposal. That then has to be subject to a further 2 months consultation. Following that, the HSE then actually produces their proposal, which is then sent to the Minister here. Assuming no delays, that's already 2 years. Then, obviously, we have to consider that proposal. A decision has to be made under the regulations within 3 months. And then, assuming that decision is made within 3 months, then we need to have affirmative resolution, secondary legislation to put that on the books. And after that, you then have a transition period for the sector normally. You add it all up, you're looking at about 4 or 5 years from very beginning to very end. If we look at, and industry and NGOs have been pointing us to in this direction, if we look at what other countries are doing, for example, Switzerland, what they don't do all of that. They look at what the EU has done, what restrictions the EU has made. They do an initial sort of consultation, speaking to industry and stakeholders, and after that, again, they retain the choice whether to adopt that decision or whether to change it, but normally they just adopt it. And that's much quicker, and basically it gets to the same outcome very, very quickly compared to where we are now. So that's just one other model that we've been pointed towards by NGOs and by industry as something which they find quite attractive. But as I say, at the moment, we are stuck with this current process that was brought over as part of the whole Brexit process, and it just means that we can't move quickly at all. And then when you add delays, and as the Minister said, with the tattoo inks and the lead and ammunition restrictions, they were initiated in April 2021, but obviously no decision had been made until this year, last year, 2025. I mean, that's already a very long time just before the decision's been made. And now, of course, we have to legislate, finding parliamentary time to do an affirmative resolution SI. So that's just the restrictions process. And we know on restrictions, that's where we've got the most concerning catch-up to do, because we've got these 8 decisions that currently the EU's made that we haven't yet made. There are 7 more EU restriction decisions in the pipeline the EU's considering, so that's an awful lot, and restrictions are the most powerful of these REACH measures. On the candidate list and on the authorisations list, as the Minister has said, there's a big backlog, but actually we're planning to catch up with basically 90% of that backlog by next April, so by the end of the next financial year. So we ought to do almost all of that pretty quickly and make up for that. But it's the restrictions where we're focusing, and that's where we need to make the changes. And then when we've done that, we should be able to actually nail all of these restrictions. And again, we'll see what the EU universal restriction looks like and whether it's something that we think is a good thing to be doing here. It's hard to tell right now because at the moment, you said the EU started top down and they're whittling it away. If we'd done bottom up, we may have ended up with the same position. But we'll see what it looks like. Don't want to form a view right now about it. But when the new reforms are in place and the Environment Improvement Plan says that they'll be in place by the end of December 2028, I think realistically it might be done before then. Then we can do this catch up, and then actually I think we'll all be in a much stronger position. And then, as we've heard, we'll have the regulation in place which will force industry to focus on alternatives to PFAS, which is the vision set out in the PFAS plan is all around moving towards a safer environment, safer for people and for the environment, but also where the sector is moving towards alternatives. And I think when we have this catch up with the new model, we'll be bang on with it.
Basically you're saying to me, because the Minister has said that we're not rejoining the EU, I think that earlier on her comment she made that, but you're saying that there's a choice here between either going through the long, complicated process that you described at the first part of your answer, or starting to take a lot of the EU regulations, decisions, etc., and incorporate them into our plan for the reform of REACH. Do you see that there is a political issue there, that on one hand some people will be unhappy that we're falling into the decisions of made by the EU and not going through our own processes?
I think in terms of this way forward, industry find it appealing because if we think about the sector as part of the context, we've got 29, this is in 2024, £29 billion of exports from our sector, of which 62% went to the EU, and then £36 billion of imports, of which 67% are from the EU. So our sector is completely integrated with the EU sector, very complex supply chains, really interwoven. So the current divergence actually has been bad for the sector. And in fact, there was a Chemicals Business Association, their latest annual survey, which came out only last week. And one of the challenges that they pointed towards, one of their top 3 challenges, was around increasing regulatory divergence, accelerating what they say is a loss of competitiveness. So for the sector, they do not want to see the sort of divergence that we've been having. If we think about other stakeholders, about the environment and about people, NGOs also are very keen for us to see our standards rising, and and at the moment, if we say the protections that we have, because we have fewer restrictions, protections for people and for the environment are not quite as high as for the EU. And this current system I've just set out here is very expensive to operate. It costs a lot of money. If we move to a more efficient system that's slicker, there'll be savings for the public purse as well. So very much, I think there's a lot of interest in moving in that way forward. And of course, let's not forget, if we move closer to the EU, then GB, Northern Ireland, also, that'll be a lot nicer too.
In an earlier answer, the Minister did say that where it was in the interests of the UK, the government would consider divergence, and indeed mentioned a couple of industries, pharmaceuticals and aerospace, I think it was. So what criteria would be used for deciding on whether or not we were going to diverge from the EU on these issues?
Yeah. Well, I was going to say, it would be case-by-case consideration, and this would be following, again, we have to decide how the process would work, but all government decisions, and all decisions would remain under the government's control. All decisions that we make are subject to consultation. That's just the way it is with our better regulation framework. So But that's sort of going into how it would work case by case. We would have to consult on it, and then we would go through much less process at the outcome. And if we look at the current restrictions that are in place, we would have to consider, is there anything in those decisions that we think we would want to diverge from when we apply them in the UK? The control would always be held by us.
Yeah, but what would the criteria be? Simply on the outcome of the consultation, what industry said, or what came back from whatever other source of information you used? I mean, surely there would be a criteria that you would apply when. What kind of factors would be included in that criteria?
Well, those precise factors, they would be set out in the proposals that we are going to set out for consultation in relation to how the new model is going to work. So we're not at a stage right now to say, let's say, I pointed out to what the Swiss model looks like. That was a model that's been put to us by industry and NGOs as an example. So what we are going to do is to set out what we think our model is going to be, and then we're going to consult on that, and that's then going to set out how it's going to work in terms of drawing from EU decisions, and then in terms of when we might diverge and how we might exercise our control. That's going to then set up the detail of what those criteria might be. Before we get there, we want to do a lot of pre-consultation activity with key stakeholders, including industry, NGOs and others, in relation to what those proposals should be. So we're not at a stage right now to say here's exactly how it's going to work. That's got to be worked up and then put to proper consultation. But as part of that, it will always be case by case, and always will be, because all government decisions that we make, regulatory decisions, are subject to consultation to make sure that we've understood the impacts on business and on others.
Well, I suppose for the committee, what we'd want to know is what weight would be given, for example, to the environmental implications of diverging and not putting restrictions on, as opposed to trade, employment or whatever. And that was really what I was trying to get at. What would be the main criteria that would be applied when deciding or making a decision about divergence?
So I think, as Marc illustrated, we'll consult on exactly how that divergence model is going to work. But of course, to reassure the committee, the environmental factor is hugely important. And I'm yet to sort of see the many people I've spoken to who supported Brexit, that anybody thinks the reason to leave the European Union was because they wanted to have lower standards in chemical contamination. So I feel that it is an important factor. But as Marc said, the exact system and how it's going to work is something that we want to be talking to all stakeholders about. And of course, environmental groups are a hugely important stakeholder as well as industry.
And have you considered the trade implications? That's probably not your department to do it, but the trade implications of divergence. Already, for example, Northern Ireland face a situation where we have to abide by EU REACH regulations. That already applies to fire extinguishers, etc. There'll be new regulations which will apply from April of this year, and then again other PFAS regulations in 2028. So what consideration or what are the implications of divergence? We understand the implications for divergence in Northern Ireland, and already there is fear that consumers will be hit with this because of, if, for example, packaging was not included, then goods coming from GB to Northern Ireland would be affected in Northern Ireland. The aerospace, the pharmaceuticals industry, very prominent in Northern Ireland. So what trade implications have you identified that could arise from divergence, and how do you intend to deal with that?
Yeah, so at the moment we have a system where there is divergence, because previous government after Brexit set in their own system, as Marc sort of explained and illustrated. This has meant, as the EU has added chemicals, as we say, to the candidate list, the authorisation list, the restriction list, there has been divergence over time. So we have a system at the moment where there is divergence, and that the cost of doing that, of Brexit and the deal that they negotiated, will have impacted business. You're quite right, because there's divergence. So what we're saying is we want to move towards looking carefully, maintaining control, but looking carefully at what the European Union is doing, making sure we're catching up around chemicals that are of concern. So we're actually, under our model, reducing divergence, which is obviously much better for Northern Ireland, because that's subjected, that's in within the EU's sort of regulations. So that should actually really help if you have a similar system working in England, Scotland and Wales than you have in Northern Ireland. That should really help.
Thank you very much. Sojan Joseph.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, new PFAS are continually being developed, and I don't think the public are fully aware of the risks of this. How does the government intend to handle the regulation and risk assessment of such large class of chemicals?
Yeah, so one of the things, we've talked about sort of our new approach of how we want to sort of add chemicals to the list and how we want to sort of catch up. But one of the other things we want to do is be looking at research and development of alternatives, because I think that's really important, because at the moment there is a list of essential use, and I think, I'd say most people, if not everyone, would agree where there's that essential use, there isn't an alternative. So I think one of the things we need to do, and this is what the PFAS plan was looking at, is sources. How can we create alternative sources? Bearing in mind, as the chair illustrated, you don't want to sort of say, well, don't use this PFAS, and then they go and use another one. So I think one of them's working with UKRI, one of them's working, funding research projects. Some of those have been industry-led, which we commend them for. Some of those can be led through government funding to look to make sure that we're reducing sources and reducing the number of ones out there. But in terms of actually regulating them, and I think Marc was trying to explain this sort of earlier, there's different ways of grouping PFAS, and depending on the different groups you put them into, then there's different ways of sort of regulating them. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, and also we always aim to take a sort of risk-based approach. So we can look at the different groupings, and then we can look at what might be a sort of an essential use, and there was earlier discussion around essential uses, where there's not an obvious alternative, and then we can see what are the risks of harm generated by the substance in question, and then also what would the implications be, the impacts be of restricting that particular substance. So that's our overall general approach, and to do that in a science-based way, which is also proportionate and targeted, and which is sort of collaborative in terms of bringing in input from the sector and from NGOs. In terms of innovation, it's worth mentioning that if you look at the UK Research and Innovation website, it does currently list 15 projects which are sort of wholly or partly focused on innovation in understanding, addressing PFAS and moving away to alternatives. And also there's other work involving other research councils too, which is sort of focusing in this field. And I think we mentioned earlier, or was mentioned in the earlier session, that the Chemicals Industry Association, they've set up a platform for various different sectors, discuss amongst themselves in a sort of peer challenge type way what they're doing about moving towards alternative substances. So although regulation obviously plays a key role, the sector itself is sort of sharing best practice and challenging each other in a way which is leading towards improvement. So I think that's also a valuable part of the overall picture.
Thank you. So are you suggesting that the government is planning to introduce a framework to distinguish between essential use framework or non-essential use, something framework are you looking to introduce?
Not a framework as such, but obviously we sort of are very aware of what some of the essential uses are. So, if we think about, we've heard some other examples, sort of medical devices, things such as catheters, implants, surgical equipment. It's very hard to find alternatives that don't have adverse impacts, protective clothing, including for the armed forces, some industrial applications, membranes and tubing, and aerospace applications, and also there are environmental trade-offs as well, which are worth thinking about. So when we think about greenhouse gas emissions and global warming and the Montreal Protocol, and we know that we've got hydrofluorocarbons at the moment, and there's a sort of commitment to reduce the amount of HFCs, I'll call them, out there by 85% by 2036. although it does sort of turn out that the only viable alternative to them are hydrofluoroolefins, or HFOs. So they're much better from a sort of global warming perspective, but they do break down into these sort of small arrowhead PFAS substances if we're not careful, including trifluoroacetic acid, or TFAs, which have been subject to a bit of interest recently. So again, we've got a trade-off there. We're trying to tackle global warming. The way of doing so is shifting away from these hydrofluorocarbons, but the alternative, which does this, also there's a risk that that's going to create a bit of PFAS. So it's not always as simple as saying we've got to ban it all, and that's a particular example where there's an environmental trade-off that we need to be thinking about very carefully.
And also, how will newly developed PFAS be assessed and regulated swiftly to avoid future regulatory gaps? Like now we're waiting for 4 or 5 years, and we are identifying new PFAS all the time. So how will you assess the regulatory swiftly, just to avoid any delays?
So that's the reforms that we were talking about, is how we look at REACH, and as Marc pointed out as well, we'll be looking really carefully at what's happening with the EU and where they get to when it comes to PFAS restrictions and what actually it sort of ends up looking like. So I think this comes down to fundamentally we need to change the system, because we have the system, as Marc explained, where it takes about 5 years to do something. I suppose the short answer is we're going to change the system to enable us to act more quickly.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Julia Buckley.
Yes, thank you. I'd just like to pick up that point about timelines, if that's okay, because I know that my farmers have questions about this around pesticides. So it's great that we're starting to export and import more, isn't it, to our European partner countries. But where there's a gap in that timetable around pesticide regulation, we can find that the UK has that time lag with the EU. So my farmers would say that they've used a pesticide that's allowed and it's in the ground, but then they're not allowed to sell that product to the EU because it's not yet been approved because of that time lag. So what can we do to help farmers that feel caught in that timeline? Are there any plans around some convergence or support?
Yeah, that's a really, really important issue. So pesticide sits outside of what we're sort of talking about today. So that's part of the EU reset negotiations and the SPS agreement. So that's like live at the moment. So, and I'm not personally involved in those negotiations, so I don't know how much of an update I can give you other than they're part of live negotiations. We absolutely, as DEFRA, hear the point. Really do hear the point that farmers are saying about this and fully understand, their particular concerns on this issue.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, before I go into my more detailed questions, I actually want to sort of pick up on a trend in the discussion so far. You've obviously made your personal commitment to this issue very clear. You spoke about not wanting our nation to be the dirty man of Europe, and a lot of the discussion been talking about catching up with Europe. And I just wanted, from a political perspective, do we not want to surpass them?
Aha, and we are in some areas. So I'm pleased you asked me that question, because then I get to tell you about drinking water. So yes, in some areas we are. So in drinking water, we have one of the best drinking water in the whole of the world. Its standards are incredibly high. The drinking water inspectorate are incredible. It is one of the most comprehensive PFAS monitoring programs globally, strongest protections in the world, and it is actually higher standards than you find in the EU and in the US. So yes, I think that's a gold star, drinking water, when it comes to showing that we, in some areas, we need to play catch up because of the system we inherited, which, frankly, in my opinion, doesn't work. But I think when it comes to drinking water, we can hold our heads up and say we are one of the best.
Okay. Interestingly, and I promise this was not choreographed, the remainder of my questions are about drinking water.
You know what I'm going to say now?
Well, the PFAS plan commits to consulting on making PFAS limits in drinking water statutory in 2026. For the sake of the record, can you confirm what estimates your department has of the potential cost of ensuring those limits would be met?
So the really good thing is, because the Drinking Water Inspectorate is so good, so they already put in non-statutory limits already. And when I came into government, I said, that's brilliant, you've got non-statutory limits, I like it, I want to make them statutory. And that's exactly what we're going to do. But just to sort of reassure you, since they put in those non-statutory limits at the moment, where they have to monitor 48 individual PFAS and comply with a value guideline of 0.1 micrograms per litre, that they've shown until the end of 2024, no drinking water supplies in England and Wales exceeded this level. So as it stands at the moment, our drinking water is compliant with it while it's non-statutory. Mm-hmm. So you might say, well, why are you making it statutory then? But I still think it's important to have it on a statutory basis as well. But it is already compliant with the non-statutory guidance.
Okay, so you wouldn't expect on that basis then that there would be substantial costs to be borne at any point in the pipeline around water treatment plans to upgrade them to be in line with those statutory limits?
With drinking water, as I say, with drinking water, they're currently already meeting their standards while it's non-statutory, and therefore they're meeting it. So then when you make it statutory, no, I wouldn't on drinking water.
Okay, well, you've answered all of my questions very clearly and simply. Back to you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. And next we come to Caldenia.
Thank you, Chair. So, as we know, one of the big problems with PFAS is that even if all production ceased tomorrow morning, which is not what you're proposing, PFAS will continue to persist in the environment. And as Barry said earlier, the Environment Agency has estimated that the cost of clean-up of only the most problem sites alone is between £31 billion and £121 billion, which is an astonishing sum. Liz Parks from the Environment Agency acknowledged in her evidence earlier this afternoon that how to fund the removal of that so-called legacy PFAS is a challenge. So I'm really worried that it's unclear at the moment who will bear the cost of cleaning up existing PFAS pollution. And I'm worried on two counts. One, I'm worried that the taxpayer will end up picking up the bill when it is not the public's fault. And on the other hand, I'm worried that generally when there is no funding for something, it doesn't happen. So my first question is, how does the government, as specific as you can be about it, how does the government intend to fund remediation of this legacy PFAS?
Okay, and as you've pointed out quite rightly, we're not ending in all entire PFAS production tomorrow, because, as pointed out, that would have a huge impact on the essential uses for which it's been used at today, and I don't imagine you're advocating for that either. So in terms of how we're going to pay for it, so the polluter pays principle, which is a really important principle from the Environment Act 2021, and under Part 2 of the Environmental Protections Act 1990, those responsible for historic land contamination are liable to pay for remediation. So where the Environment Agency, through its permitting regime, can identify the pollution source, those people will be made to pay for remediation. But you're quite right to highlight where you have legacy contamination and you can't accurately identify the source of which it's come from, which is an important issue. That's where we're using the land remediation pathway scheme, which covers more than just PFAS, but there's an £80 million fund there as well. But I think fundamentally, if we want to end the continual pollution of PFAS, then you do need to deal with the source. And that means looking at where we can develop alternatives. That means looking at adding in those restrictions. That's all those things I've covered so far around how do you speed up the restrictions, how do you speed up adding chemicals onto the candidate list. So I think there's different ways to tackle this. So deal with the source is one of them, and deal with the legacy contamination. So, as I say, if you can identify who's done it, polluter pays. If you can't identify who's done it, because it's just impossible to, then there is a small fund available. Well, £80 million.
Yeah, well, small is the word in that sentence that worries me, obviously. Big difference between 80 million and the numbers in the billions that my colleague Barry shared earlier. So what are the sums that were done that produce that £80 million figure, and how far do you think that's going to go?
I think that's genuinely impossible to answer at the moment, which is why I think the research that's highlighted in the plan is so important. Because I think at the moment we know that there's a big problem. We know that we're going to have to deal with it, but it's not accurate enough at this stage for me to be able to say to you it's going to cost this much, it's in these locations, because we don't have that information, which is why having that research and monitoring is really, really important. And what probably will end up having to happen is over the next few years, as our intelligence increases, as our understanding and research and monitoring and knowledge about where this is increases, then we are going to have to look at more what we can do on legacy. So it's a bit difficult for me to say at the moment what my estimate is of cost, or what, and therefore how did I get to this figure, because at the moment we simply don't have enough information out there. It is an estimate. We don't actually have the knowledge, which is why, having such, as pointed out as a negative, but I would argue it's a positive, having an awful lot of research and monitoring in the plan matters so much.
Okay.
Also, can I say that there is also a clear distinction between legacy contamination, where the business, let's say, that was responsible no longer exists, versus actually ongoing contamination. The cost of cleanup might be high. Where you've got ongoing sites where they're currently active, you do have the Environment Agency's site permitting regime, where they engage with those sites, and the Environment Agency knows where the sort of higher priority sites are through all of their monitoring, and they are engaging with site owners in relation to what's happening at those sites, and also in relation to dealing with any potential contamination. I think the issue you're focusing on is more around, do we have any particular sites where you really can't pin it on anybody, and then what do you do about obviously dealing with those costs? And we've spoken about costs falling to the taxpayer, but obviously business also pays tax, so they would cover that to some extent too.
Yeah, I guess I'm trying to get at understanding that you're saying that more research needs to be done. I'm trying to get at a rough sense of how much of the cleanup of legacy PFAS is going to be attributable to a particular source, and how much of it, roughly, if you can give a rough sense, or you can't even do that at this stage.
Not at this stage. I think that is why I think having that monitoring and research matters so much, so we can fully understand the extent of the problem. That's why it's important.
Okay. Moving on slightly, my final question is around, you said in I think it was your first answer to me, that obviously you want to hopefully limit the production of PFAS in the first place. So, and in the government's PFAS plan, there is an indication that you want to incentivise or encourage the development of PFAS alternatives. But can you be a bit more specific about how the government intends to do that incentivisation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it is really important that we look at how we move away from PFAS and look at alternatives, but with the proviso around that you don't then use a similar chemical that is just as bad. So I just put that caution out there. So I mean, there's clear regulation, using regulation as a tool. So again, that goes back to what I've been talking about around UK REACH and how do we use that. So there's regulation, which obviously provides a clear incentive. And I would strongly argue that actually putting something onto the candidate list is a strong incentive for businesses to move away from using that chemical. But also, I think industry has done some work on this. The cosmetics industry, I think, is a really good example of an organisation that's done this. And we do quite a bit of chemical industry round tables where we talk to them, talk about innovation, having those discussions with them. Also looking at how do we create a demand for PFAS-free alternatives. So one of the ways in which we can create demand for PFAS-free alternative is around public procurement. So, for example, we're looking at guidance for the purchase of textiles by government, so looking at the buying standards. So that government's role in public procurement, it's creating that demand for PFAS-free by actually saying, with these certain textiles, we'll be looking for PFAS-free. So there's different ways of, I think, trying to achieve this. So regulation, through supporting industry, through research, through UKRI, that's another way of doing it, through looking at our role, as I say, on public procurement. And I think all of these are ways in which that we incentivise. And I have to say, there is a positive growth story from this. We actually think that the PFAS-free market in the EU is expected to reach around £12 billion by 2040. So we see this as an area where the UK can actually show leadership in terms of innovation, because this is a market that is only going to own to grow. And one of the other things that we've noticed, which again outside government control, but I see it as a positive, is investors in the financial sector are increasingly looking at the use of PFAS as a potential future liability. So there's pressure coming from investors that they're looking at companies and thinking, well, this could be a future liability if you continue to use this PFAS. So I think it feels like the tide is moving towards the how do we move away from the use of some of these chemicals. But which is all positive, and my only caution is I just want to ensure that what we move to is a safe alternative.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Davis.
Thank you, Chair. I've just got some further questions about remediation, if that's okay. But as part of this inquiry, we did visit a site which has been affected by PFAS, and frankly, I don't know how that business has survived with the money that it's had to put into mitigating the effect of a product which it legitimately made because it had a public good in terms of putting out fire very effectively. Are there any conversations between your department and DBT to help the business department understand how this affects businesses that were essentially doing the right thing? Now they've got this huge clean-up bill.
We're doing a round table soon, actually, with DBT. It's slightly different. That's looking more at consumer products, which is trying to get ahead of the problem and how do we sort of prevent the problem happening in the first place. And we do...
Specifically in terms of remediation for sites that are highly contaminated, rather than looking ahead to avoiding it happening again.
We do work closely with DBT on all chemical sector matters. So that includes, obviously, showing what's happening with the sort of remediation cases, and also other developments in the sector relating to sector resilience and to future regulation, and also other factors which are really important to the sector's competitiveness, such as energy prices. So we do work very closely indeed with that department.
Okay, does that include sort of sharing best practice? Because when we went to that site, they'd invested a huge amount of money, and I think it was an Australian piece of equipment, and to remediate the grounds, the surface water. I think this sort of gave us the impression that it was really the manufacturers of that equipment that were leading the charge in that space. And I just wondered how effective is government at sharing information across the sector about steps that contaminated sites can take to do their remediation.
So I think there's definitely innovation in how do we deal with PFAS and what we can do to destroy it. As was highlighted by the Environment Agency earlier, at the moment the way to destroy it is 1,100 degrees centigrade incineration. However, there are other innovative ways coming on, but obviously we want to carefully monitor them to ensure that they are being effective. And I went to go visit a site myself in Immingham on Monday to go and look at what they're doing there. And it's really interesting because they're taking carbon and they're putting something on it, that's a chemical term, and then that is used to sort of filter and sort of hold the PFAS, and then they destroy the PFAS from it afterwards. So there's some really interesting innovation coming in this space, but I think, as I'm sure you would support and the rest of the committee, we have to be precautionary about this, and we have to make sure that everything that we get through is working as effectively as we want to. But that's not to say it's not effective. But I think it's important that we do this really carefully.
Will national standards be introduced for PFAS destruction?
So the EA already have. So the EA issue. I don't know if it's guidance or it's statutory guidance, but they on what's the best way to destroy it. And at the moment, what they've said is the best way to destroy it is 1,100 degrees centigrade, incineration. However, they are constantly sort of looking at that. And as I say, this could be a growth story. This could be where there's innovation and where there's exciting things happening, which I'm in full support of. And I think this, we might be coming to a different answer in a few months' time as different things are tried and different innovations sort of happen.
Just on incineration. We know there's not very many sites in the country that can undertake that work, and actually the price has got more and more expensive. I think it's £16 to get rid of 6 litres of fire foam. Is there any sort of market oversight function that government could lean on to stop companies, manufacturers that are trying to do the right thing being ripped off?
Yeah, you're right in that there are only 2 hazardous waste incinerators permitted to accept PFAS. So at the moment we judge that there's sufficient capacity to meet needs, but obviously as we sort of take more action on this, as we discover more and therefore want to destroy more, we anticipate there's going to be greater demand. And that's why I think it's really important that we look at other innovations and we look at sort of other things that are coming through and other technology that's in the pipeline. Because I think you're right to say that at the moment there are just 2. But I would also sort of say I know where we have these waste incinerations, they're not always that popular in the local area. So I'm not sure advocating for many more would be popular.
Okay, just on innovation, perhaps would you be able to say a little bit about what the government is doing to fund the expansion of UK lab and incineration capacity to firstly support the monitoring of the whole PFAS situation, but also its destruction?
Yeah, I mean, on monitoring, we do exceptionally well, but do you want to explain about the monitoring?
Yeah, so a lot of the monitoring that's taking place relates to, at the moment, led by the Environment Agency, relates to water, but it is increasingly focusing on land and also on mammals. And then also a lot of the water focuses on sort of coastal and estuary areas too, rather than just rivers. And part of the monitoring also involves collecting data from industry. So, for example, there's a UK pollutant release and transfer register, and the PFAS plan referred to that being expanded to cover more air emissions and that information coming from industry. And then we've also mentioned that industry play quite an important role on the water side, again on the chemicals investigation programme. So in all these areas, there's a lot going on actually to sort of understand where we are with PFAS. And I think on monitoring, we are indeed in a very strong position.
That includes, funding cutting-edge lab research, because I know a lot of this monitoring is kind of the sector just doing it itself and reporting its information to government. Or to the government's agencies.
A lot of our research programme actually does focus on this sort of monitoring side. It also relates to sort of setting thresholds and standards as well. So I think we may have mentioned in the previous session that the Environment Agency has just published a report in relation to water, in relation to setting 4 thresholds for water. And again, that can be a precursor to setting future environmental quality standards. But that came out, I think, only a week or so ago. And again, that was following some sort of research investment, and that's a really, really sort of important step forward.
Thank you. Barry Gardner.
I wanted just to tease out this 80 million figure remediation cost that you spoke about, because I'm sure, Mr. Casale, you'll know the Commission, the European Commission, has published a report in which they say that Europe is on track to pay at least 440 billion euros to deal with the pollution impacts from PFAS. They said that cost could actually soar to nearly 2 trillion under a more ambitious cleanup regime. And they say that even if they had implemented a full ban now, Europe would still be left with costs of 330 billion euros by 2050. That's the Commission's own published report. So I wonder what estimates your department has provided to the Treasury of the potential costs of this. And in Europe, certainly the policy officer for the Chemicals and European Environmental Bureau, Naomi Jegou, has said that the EU must turn off the tap now through an ambitious restriction of PFAS present in consumer products and used in industrial processes, because these costs are staggering. And I just wonder what the cross-government recognition is of the potential staggering costs to the UK from this?
I think we've kind of covered this a bit in the session already, but it does come back down to who's liable for meeting those costs. Is it current businesses or not? And then it comes back down to case-by-case consideration of what actually...
Well, for what already exists, be able to track it back. The Minister has already told us that once they're mixed together, and particularly once they become degraded, it's almost impossible to identify the source. And given that it was legal at the time for them to use these products, one assumes that you wouldn't be chasing retrospectively to do so. Even if you did, you know as well as I what would happen, and that is that the companies would go into liquidation and they would reform in another way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The approach we take is where there is a particular high-risk site that is subject to consideration and investigation, I say, under the legislation we've referred to. And in light of that, if remediation is needed, then if a company is liable for that, then they pay for that. If not, then it's forced to the local authority. They're responsible for contaminated land. If the local authority can't cover it, then we have other support, and we've mentioned that particular scheme which exists. So that's the
but that wasn't my
approach.
question. I understand that what you're telling me is that the expectation that we all have is that ultimately this will fall back on the taxpayer in one way or another. But my question to you was, how do you justify the £80 million figure that you quoted and the Minister quoted, and what estimates have you given to Treasury of the realistic, what you're called the staggering bill that may accrue?
So as I mentioned earlier, this is why research and monitoring matters, because you can't give an accurate estimate to Treasury if you haven't got the information you need. And this is why in the plan research is mentioned so often, and why I'm so pleased it is, because it needs to be there. Because we cannot go to Treasury, because if you want to go to Treasury and you want to say to the Chancellor, OK, we need some money, OK, have you got to that figure? We guessed it because Europe had a similar figure. I think that laughed me out the door. Whereas what we actually want to do is be able to go and say, this is all the information we have, this is all the research we've done, this is the monitoring we've done, this is our calculation around legacy, and come up with something that's more mature than sort of making a judgment based on another jurisdiction.
But can I bring Carla Denyer in?
I'm going to come in with a supplementary question to Barry's there. Barry, can I just first of all check, Mark, that I've understood correctly? That 31 to 121 billion pound range from the Environment Agency, that was just, and you were talking about the EU just then, but that number, that was UK, right? UK. Okay, well, in that case, I couldn't do the mental maths when I was asking you my question earlier, but I have since got the calculator out and worked out what £80 million is as a percentage of £31 billion. I understand that when I asked you earlier that if you had a rough idea of what proportion of the PFAS already in the environment would be traceable to source and not, and understandably you can't give a number at the moment, but the implication of the fact that the government set aside an £80 million fund currently, as compared to the lowest end of the Environment Agency's estimate of how much it'll cost to clean up, the implication of the difference of those numbers is that it will be possible to identify the source and to somebody that can still be chargeable, so a company that still exists, in 99.7% of cases. To me, that seems unrealistic given what we've said about the way it breaks down. Do you share my sense that that is an unrealistic number?
I hate to repeat myself, but I think this is why we need to do the research and the evidence and find out what the accurate situation is. At the moment, we are dealing with estimates and projections. We are not dealing with facts. So until we have that evidence, we cannot have an accurate idea about what the cost will enable to be. So where did the 80 come from?
Well, the 80 would have come from a view about what was needed to support those cases where local authorities felt that they themselves were liable or had to pick up some liabilities and couldn't cover that. So as with all government schemes, no doubt that will be subject to review and consideration. And if it's found out that actually that scheme needed to provide for a greater amount of funding, then that will be considered in due course. If it's found that actually that amount of funding did the job in the circumstances, then we'll see. So I think we start off with a scheme, we review it, we monitor it, and then there are conclusions drawn, and then it feeds back into the public spending cycle that we have.
Thank you. Olivia Blake.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a quick question. And I should probably declare a quick interest that I used to be a research scientist. But what cross-departmental discussions have you had about funding both biomedical, biochemical and public health research into the health impacts, not only at a cellular level but at population levels as well as a molecular level, of the impact of PFAS on those different issues?
I think, yeah, so on research in general, our researchers engage with others across government, so they're part of a sort of wider...
Sorry, I want to know what how the department is influencing other departments to fund this area.
DEFRA's influencing...
Other departments to put money up front to fund the research that we need in the biochemical and biomedical and public health research.
Well, we do that as part of ongoing engagement with other departments as part of the government-wide science net. So basically we link up with UKHSA. Obviously they have a lead interest in this space, so that our scientists and their scientists will engage with each other to agree what they think the research priority should be. That's the general approach.
So each department has a chief scientific advisor, as I'm sure you know, and the chief scientific advisors of all different departments have discussions together about some cross-government issues. On the exact details of what currently the chief scientific advisor is working on in this area, I would have to come back to you with that, Chair.
Thank you.
Appreciate that.
So, yeah, I mean, I think on reading the plan, and my initial impression, and I don't think it's changed from this hearing, is that the rhetoric around the scale of the issues facing us and the systemic change required, absolutely hear what you were saying, Minister, about the fact, well, at least there is a plan here. It wasn't even being talked about previously under the previous government. That's better than that, and that's hard to argue with. But that sort of rhetoric about the systemic change doesn't entirely correlate with what we actually read in terms of the initial indicative actions in the plan. And so if people were picking this plan up to sort of bring this to a close, and we're looking for the real sort of red meat that shows that we're going to have the systemic change, get rid of the regime that's failed and move to a new future with this decisive action, which will be the section that you think that they would most look at and say, well, that is a real change. It's not tinkering around the edges. It's not looking to find a bit more evidence, but it's actually really a sign of the systemic change we're now going to have.
The part on reform to UK REACH.
Yeah, I think that's the most decisive thing. Well, thank you very much indeed. I appreciate your evidence and indeed that of Mr. Casale. We'll bring this session to a close. Thank you very much. Order.